Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to Demystifying the Rules of Fiction. Do you really have to follow them? Writers tend to have a lot of questions about the rules of fiction, those elusive guidelines that shape our narratives and mold our creative endeavors. Are these rules rigid dictates that threaten creative autonomy? Or do they serve as an underlying structure, providing frameworks that nurture and enhance storytelling prowess? The answers are found in digging down to the true essence of fiction rules, exploring what they are, what they decidedly are not, and to what degree we should adhere to them in crafting stories that work. So even just a cursory search into the rules of fiction brings up a dizzying array of opinions. Although many studious articles promise to share the rules of fiction, many other titles are dismissive. And as I scrolled through the results, I found a post I had written many years ago, the title of which fit right in. It was, "Writing Rules? We don't need no rules." But is this really true? Most articles with titles like these will tell you why art cannot be contained by rules, and then tell you why you should follow the rules after all. And this reflects the mixed relationship most writers, particularly those just starting out, have with the rules. Sometimes I get a comment or an email from writers declaring their creative genius is too great to be bound by convention, and the rules are just for stupid hacks. And notably, these emails often suffer from missing capitalization and punctuation. Other times, I hear from studious new writers who are consumed with worry about learning how to do absolutely everything by the rules. Now, obviously, both approaches are extremes. The true value and caution of the rules lies somewhere in between. So, do writers have to follow the rules? Depends entirely on how you define rules. Much of the debate about the value of the rules of fiction comes down to definition. The very idea that something as inherently innovative and chaotic as creativity can or should be contained by rules often has writers panicking and rioting. For many writers, the discovery that there is such a thing as the rules of fiction creates a feeling of claustrophobia. After all, much of the joy of writing is its pure freedom. Indeed, many people who might have been writers got scared off early on by such mind-numbing school exercises as the dreaded Roman numeral outline. The word rules inevitably triggers our superego's notion of a stern, authoritarian, and perhaps even tyrannical figure telling us what we are and are not allowed to do, and threatening consequences if we don't fall into line. Not exactly the stuff of inspiration, much less fun. And creativity needs to be fun in order to thrive. It needs that attitude of play, of childlike curiosity and wonder. And the idea of the rules can seem antithetical to that. However, if you stop to think about it, the idea that fiction, or any other art form, can exist without structure is clearly untrue. Even just at the level of spelling and grammar, agreed upon conventions are necessary to foster communication. At root, that's really all the rules are. Conventions recognized for their efficacy in communicating within a common language. As with any system, balance is necessary. We need a little dose of the newness of chaos, but we also need order. We need a liberality that embraces the evolution of innovation, but we also need the conservatism of the old guard passing down the literary legacy. We need creativity, but we also need logic. We need freedom, but we also need structure. The former is impossible to sustain without the latter. The trouble comes either when writers want to throw all the rules out the window in the belief that they need to reinvent the form, or when writers feel pressure to conform for the sake of confirmation. Really, the whole trouble is that when we speak about the rules of fiction, we're really not talking about rules at all. We're not even, as the pirates would have it, talking about guidelines. We're talking about deeper truths of both the art form and its reflection of reality. Coming to an understanding of what the rules really are can help all writers deepen their comprehension of the art form and their ability to create freely within it. So today, let's take a quick overview of what the rules of fiction are and are not. The rules of fiction are not guidelines from some grim writer in the sky. So let's just examine this most fundamental misconception first. The word rules tends to bring with it the subconscious idea that someone out there must be reinforcing those rules. Sometimes we might assume this is the gatekeepers, agents, and editors, but the underlying belief is that the right way to create fiction was handed down to us from on high like some literary version of the Ten Commandments. Break the rules, and a lightning bolt is sure to strike your poor little novel and shrivel it into ash. This belief can also evoke a feeling of resentment and jealousy in unpublished authors who can point out so many successful novels that clearly did not follow the rules. But although certain conventions and archetypes certainly do exist, which we'll explore in a minute, the idea that they have been passed down by any foundational authority is simply untrue. The rules of fiction are not peer-enforced, fiddly little dictates. Writers may also sometimes sense that the rules will be enforced from the outside in by peers. After all, everybody's got an opinion about how to write a book. Especially in the beginning, most new writers will tout the rules to fellow writers, insisting on mutual observance. Often, this group accountability can be wonderfully helpful and educative. But writers must recognize that just because someone in their writing group, or everyone online, seems to be touting an unbreakable rule, doesn't mean they, A, know what they're talking about any more than you do, or B, have any authority whatsoever over your choices for your story. The writing rules are not immutable. So all writers can breathe a sigh of relief now. Writing rules are not immutable. As such, they clearly aren't even rules. They can be broken. They will be broken. And thank God for that. Creativity demands experimentation and innovation. As my pal Ian Malcolm always says, life will find a way. Any system that errs too heavily toward control, order, logic, etc., will become tyrannical and destroy itself. This doesn't belittle the vital importance of order, but we must remember that its entire function is to recognize and foster the fruits of creativity. The rules of fiction are not arbitrary. So with the previous in mind, it is equally important to acknowledge that the rules of fiction are not arbitrary. They exist for good reasons, ones that contribute to the deep truths of the art form and of communication. Now, tongue-in-cheek, we often say, if there is one rule of writing, it is simply know the rules before you break them. And what this speaks to is the necessity of understanding the deeper meaning upon which any seemingly arbitrary rule is founded. Once you understand that, you can determine whether breaking it is truly the most functional choice for your story. The rules of fiction are not genre tropes. Writers often confuse general rules of fiction with genre tropes. Although genre conventions do guide how particular types of stories are written as a sort of mutual contract between writer and reader, they are not rules. Genre offers archetypal guidelines for how to tell different stories of the human experience, as brilliantly explored in John Truby's recent book, Anatomy of Genres. But despite what newbie writers sometimes think, the individual tropes, for example, romances enemies to lovers, or fantasies chosen one, or mysteries incompetent police, these are not rules and do not have to be followed as such. The rules of fiction are not life or death. The rules. They just sound so serious. So many of us take the rules very seriously, to the point sometimes of a cultural trauma response. Mess up the rules and you're doomed. Not only will no one ever publish you or read you or take you seriously as a writer, but actually this is just proof that you're a horrible person under it all. Really, I think this is why so many writers experience knee-jerk hatred toward the idea of rules for art. And it just ain't so. This is the voice of the toxic inner critic, one many writers confront. The toxicity of this voice doesn't mean the rules themselves are toxic, but recognize if this is how you're interacting with them so you can move into a more balanced and generative perspective. All right, so far we've basically established that what the rules of fiction are not is rules, and yet they should still generally be observed. So what does that make them? So let's examine what the rules of fiction really are. The rules of fiction are theory. At root, the rules of fiction are simply theory, story theory. They are the collective and emergent theories writers and readers have collected over the past couple millennia about what makes a good story. Because of the profound body of work available to us all to study, and because we learn story through osmosis even when we're not consciously studying, this huge context means these theories are now highly evolved. However, they're still theories, and they're still evolving. With every new story added to the larger context, the information that creates these theories increases, allowing for infinite revision and refinement. Nevertheless, at any given point, they offer a tremendous amount of information about our predecessors' trial and error. And from that, we can continuously extrapolate what seems most effective in communicating with readers. The rules of fiction are patterns. At the root of theory is pattern recognition. Story theory is entirely based on examining the patterns that emerge from the large body of recorded storytelling. When we can examine thousands of years of story and recognize that certain plot beats are found consistently all the way back to Homer, we can confidently extrapolate that this is a pattern that has stood the test of time. From there, as story theorists, we get to explore why these patterns of plot and structure are so enduring and why we might do well to apply them in our own stories. The rules of fiction are archetypal truths. So which came first, the archetype or the truth? Certainly arguments can be made that the patterns of story point straight to the immutable truths of human experience. But at the least, the patterns themselves have given rise to archetypes that have become truth, or at least representative of truth to humans. As such, most of the rules of fiction point to deeper principles than simply effective communication. Everything from the underlying structure of character arc and theme, to dictums such as write what you know, to leave out the parts readers tend to skip, point to deeper psychological reasons than may be immediately evident. The rules of fiction are functional forms. So why follow the rules of fiction? The most convincing argument is simply because they work. If you want to write a good book, get published, and sell lots of copies, your best bet is to base that book upon the functional forms represented by the rules. This doesn't mean you have to or should follow every rule, and certainly, as I hope is clear by this point, not slavishly. It also doesn't mean that any bestseller that broke some obvious rule is somehow proof that all rules are bogus. But start with the rules of spelling, punctuation, and grammar, and then work your way up to the rules of dialogue, POV, and narrative, and round out your journey with the rules of plot, character, and theme. Congrats! You have just created a functional story form. The rules are logic, functioning as the handmaiden of creativity. Because of the false paradox that is often created between logic and creativity, writers may balk at the rules of fiction simply because they are logical. The very fact they are based on emergent patterns means they are a recognition of the logic inherent in story. More than that, we are then able to move beyond simply perceiving the patterns to proactively using logic to extrapolate and hypothesize about them. Much of this is in service to simply understanding the patterns/rules, but it is also in service to further innovation, aka creativity. If you understand the rules, the patterns of good fiction, you have the possibility of getting ahead of the curve by creating the next big innovation in the cycle. As ever, the caveat here is that logic and creativity must exist in balance on their two opposite ends of the polarity. The whole system falls apart if writers overvalue the logic of the rules. In fact, this overvaluation is actually illogical. Equally, however, a rejection of the importance of logic is also destructive. At its simplest, to reject logic in storytelling is to reject a true aid. An understanding of the logic of story and the rules of fiction can only help you wrangle all that wild creativity. When you understand story theory and the rules of fiction, you have the opportunity to unburden your creativity and let it fly free with far more confidence and safety. And finally, the rules of fiction are a contract between writer and reader. Readers and viewers enter your story as an act of faith. They are opening their minds and their hearts to you, not to mention committing money and time. And as such, they are entitled to expect a good experience. Whether or not that experience is good will depend in no small part upon how well the writer understands the rules of the game. Note, however, I didn't say how well the writer follows the rules. You can dot all your I's and cross all your T's without having a clue what you're doing or why. But from the reservoirs of a deeper understanding of the principles that underlie the rules of fiction, you will create an experience that both holds and challenges readers in all the best ways. The debate over the rules of fiction unfolds because writers grapple with whether the rules are stifling constraints or foundational structures. The varied relationships writers have with these rules, from outright defiance to rigid adherence, underscores the need for balance. In essence, the rules of fiction offer a stalwart harmony between creativity and structure, enhancing story by respecting the principles of effective communication. So I hope you'll stop by the site and communicate with me on this. How do you approach the rules of fiction in your writing? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of Helping Writers Become Authors.